We are getting into chapter 2 now, media effects. And in a lot of ways, this chapter may be the one of everything we talk about that you can really kind of connect the most with because we're all members of society and we all have some level of experience with the media and we can all develop opinions about what media effects are and how those play a role in the way people are. So in chapter 2, it covers mass media and messages and tries to give us a little bit of foundation for media effects theories. Talks about how we can do the research to measure media effects, and then addresses at the end some controversies, including trying to help us to appreciate where there are some limitations on some of the theories as we use them to study the media. Keep in mind, this chapter is a survey overview about media effects. It clearly leaves out a lot of important theories. It just gives us the foundation of some major ones. So we do talk about propaganda as part of the way people communicate. Propaganda can be called the manipulation of information to influence public opinion. And as chapter 2 tells us, that's not inherently good or bad. What we do want to try to appreciate, as we've tried to address a bit so far even, is whether or not we can recognize the propaganda. Do we know that the creator of a message has a particular agenda? So we kind of learned over the 20th century how to use propaganda better. So if you were to research that a little bit more, you could find what Germany was doing in World War II and what the US chose to do along with the Allies to use its own propaganda. And this can go back, of course, to World War I and the propaganda to recruit people to join the army and to join the war effort. With media effects and behavior, there's debate about the impact of violent media content, whether it's in movies or video games. And so, of course, there are first-person shooter video games that have very violent content. And you can think, well, that's just entertainment, but can it have an effect on people? There is that debate over violent video games. And studies are done about media effects, and some of those studies point to a link between violent games and angry thoughts and aggression in individuals that have played them. Now, is that a short-term effect immediately after playing a game, or is that accumulated effect? So a relationship doesn't equal causation, and these kinds of examples help us to appreciate, number one, we can't just think about these things in the way it seems to appear to us and come to a conclusion. What we kind of see as things that we're exposed to, we would call anecdotal evidence. So think about this. You get in your car and you're driving around Dallas, Fort Worth, and the drivers around you are fairly aggressive in the way they drive. They're driving over the speed limit. And you think, 5, 6 years ago, people didn't drive like this. And so clearly you've decided that people are more aggressive drivers now than they were 5 or 6 years ago. Well, that's just an anecdotal evidence type thing. It may appear that way to you, but we don't know it until we can measure it. So again, within this and this one example, we don't have a demonstration of effects, but we also can't just easily dismiss that there are no effects because we don't think there are. There also is the issue with cultural stereotypes, the way that we portray groups of people in media, whether this is in a television show or a video game or a movie or any other way. Clearly, there can be stereotypes, which we can define as an image or character that generalizes or oversimplifies a particular group of people. And so our chapter talks about how media images and celebrities have been demonstrated to send messages in the roles that they play and in the content in the media that are about cultural values. Chapter also talks about new media in society, and of course we have to appreciate how people are communicating now because of the internet. We have more access to information. We have convergence of technologies and convergence of forms of communication, and we have greater personal participation going on through things related to social media and all the other kinds of elements of the internet. In media effects theories, then, we look at some examples, and we know that there are uh, kind of the impression from people, and this goes back to really kind of early media research, that assumed that there were direct effects. So that assumes that audiences passively accept media messages and react predictably, kind of like what was called a hypodermic needle model, where you just inject the people with the information and they react predictably. So that direct effects theory of the media was something that was believed early on, but was discredited through research. The agenda setting theory says that mass media determines issues that the public considers most important. The uses and gratifications theory that our chapter gives us a little bit more detail says essentially the media fulfill audience needs. Symbolic interactionism says the self is derived from and develops through human interaction. And so that helps us to define how we do things and who we are through that symbolic interaction with the media. The spiral of silence theory suggests that individuals who hold a minority opinion will silence themselves and therefore not allow their voice to be heard. So our chapter gives us a little bit more detail on that theory. Media logic theory says common media formats and styles serve as a way of perceiving the world. The cultivation theory or cultivation analysis says heavy exposure to media cultivates an illusory perception of reality, that cultivation of our behaviors and our way of viewing the world happens as a result of the media. So those are some of the theories. And again, this chapter is not trying to give us a full survey of everything, but it gives us some examples. How do we then do that? We have to look at methods of research being quantitative or qualitative. Our chapter is not really dealing with qualitative research, even though what Marshall McLuhan did is in that camp of qualitative research. The methods of research listed here fit more into the quantitative area, where we would have some statistics and do analysis of those statistics. So that might be a content analysis, it might be a social role analysis, it might be a depth interview, it might be a survey that we do, it could be a rhetorical analysis, it could be the use of focus groups, and it could be participant observation as just some of those ways. How do we ultimately collect this data that we're going to then use a theory to demonstrate that we think something is occurring within media effects? Well, what about controversies? Well, is the audience active or passive? We get a sense in our chapter about how do we evaluate that. Is the media liberal? So we have some examples in the chapter that have been shown of coverage of political candidates on one side or the other. We have evidence about the fact that journalists tend to be more liberal themselves individually. So media bias can very clearly be there. Are the people who are covering stories and saying things doing it based on a neutral point of view, or do they have a bias on one side or the other? Media decency in the sense of sexual content is discussed and is part of our issue of media effects. And then even the idea of media consolidation. If only a limited number of people own most of the media, then we have a very limited number of voices, and that's also a part of the concern about media effects. So that's a little bit of our overview of some of the major things to read about in Chapter 2. Let's do a little bit of review of some of these. So what is it that's defined in Chapter 2 as the manipulation of information to influence public opinion? And says the definition works well for us because its study and use has had an enormous influence on the role of persuasion in modern mass media, and that is about understanding propaganda. So is this true or false? Violent, sexual, and compulsive behaviors have been linked to media consumption and thus have proven the effects of media on culture. So look at that statement and recognize, no, we have not proven the effects of media on culture. So here's the thing we will often say to try to kind of grasp this. Sometimes there are some effects to some people in certain situations because of media content and their behavior. Sometimes there are some effects to some people. The problem is we can do all different kinds of studies and it becomes challenging to find a way that multiple studies continue to reveal a level of truth. We do try to do it based on a theoretical foundation of the media theories that we use, and then we try to find a good method for being able to measure that. So, yes, we've proven some things, but in the broad sense, no, we have not proven a correlation. True or false, celebrities and media content can reinforce cultural stereotypes that marginalize certain groups. That is true. That's not the correct answer coming up on the screen, but that is true. In discussing the impact of our internet-driven modern media, Chapter 2 says some analysts have used what term to describe the way media consumers filter information, connected to the term that was an allusion to the political fragmentation of Eastern Europe's Balkan states following World War I. Well, we've had Balkanization, and now we have cyber Balkanization. What theory of media states that mass media determine the issues that concern the public rather than the public's views? That is agenda setting theory. Practitioners of what theory study the ways the public consumes media. This theory states that consumers use the media to satisfy specific needs or desires. That is the uses and gratifications theory. What theory states that those who hold a minority opinion silence themselves to prevent social isolation, and explains the role of mass media in the formation and maintenance of dominant opinions. As minority opinions are silenced, the illusion of consensus grows, and so does the social pressure on those minority voices to adopt the dominant position. That is the spiral of silence theory. What theory states that heavy exposure to media causes individuals to develop an illusory perception of reality based on the most repetitive and consistent messages of a particular medium. That is cultivation analysis. That one. Of the methods used for researching media effects, what is a research technique that involves analyzing the content of various forms of media? Through this approach, researchers hope to understand both the people who created the content and the people who consumed it. Content analysis is one of our methods for researching media effects. Of the methods used for researching media effects, which is it that involves examining the styles used in media and attempting to understand the kinds of messages those styles convey? That's doing a rhetorical analysis. And of those methods for researching media effects, in which one do researchers try to become part of the group they're studying? The technique is typically associated with anthropological studies in which a researcher lives with members of a particular culture, that is, participant observation. In describing some of the controversies regarding media theories, Chapter 2 says, one of the criticisms of which theory is that the studies are unable to prove cause and effect. Essentially, no one has truly shown that the media agenda sets the public agenda and not the other way around. That is a criticism of agenda setting theory. So remember, as we wrap up here, quizzes for the chapters. We'll have questions to help you test yourself for what you know from the PowerPoints and the chapter. And always use the end of each chapter's assessment that lists the major chapter review to help you focus on the main ideas. And those are some of our major ways of thinking about all the issues in Chapter 2.